Good morning, students. Today we come to the second part of the detailed analysis of the essay titled Modern Fiction. Modern Fiction is an essay written by Virginia Woolf, which was published in the Times Literary Supplement on April 10, 1919 as Modern Novels, which was later revised and published as Modern Fiction in the Common Reader. Here we get a brief discussion on the major trends in modern novel, and particularly this essay is a criticism of all those writers and literature from the previous generation. And this essay acts as a guide for writers of modern fiction to write what they feel, not what society or publishers want them to write. And this essay discredits particularly three major writers whom she terms as Edwardians, particularly H.G. Wells, Arnold Bennett, and John Galsworthy. And this is how she began this essay. Her point is that art should innovate. So modern fiction, according to her, it should be an improvement upon the old, and she attacks all those Edwardian writers, as I said earlier, Edwardian writers like H.G. Wells, Arnold Bennett, and Galsworthy, and she calls these three as materialists because they are not concerned with the spirit but with the body. They write about all those unimportant things that they spend immense skill and the immense industry making the trivial and transitory look true and enduring. So here she particularly attacks the writings of H.G. Wells and Arnold Bennett. Her point is that what their works lack is life. We call it life or spirit, truth or reality, and that essential thing has moved off from the works of these three writers. So they give more importance to the solidity, to bring solidity to that external fabric. And they invest so much energy in bringing that solidity that they forget about human lives present in the story. So here she says the writers are forced to take a particular writing style, and she talks about particularly about this tyranny of realism. Here writers are constrained not by their free will but by some powerful and unscrupulous tyrant. So here tyrant is none other than all those plot structures, all those catalogs like comedy, tragedy, love interest. So if you want to bring your novel to perfection, these tyrants should be obeyed, says Virginia Woolf. And then she says what a modern writer should focus upon. A modern writer must focus on what mind sees, and this mind receives myriad impressions, all those trivial, fantastic, and evanescent. So, a writer should focus upon that impression. He should base his work upon his own feelings, not upon all those conventions. And here she ended with her concept of life. She says that life is not a series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged. It is not a series of tails which is symmetrically arranged. For her, life is a luminous halo, a semi-transparent envelope surrounding us from the beginning of consciousness to the end. And it is the task of the novelist to convey that spirit, that unknown, uncircumscribed spirit, whatever aberrations, whatever complexity it may display, it may have. It is the task of the novelist to convey that spirit without mixing all those alien and external, to avoid all those alien and external fabric as far as possible. So here Woolf asks for a style which is completely different from what is known as conventional style. So here we ended the first part of the lecture. Now we move to the second part where she moves on, talking about particular works of James Joyce. While Woolf criticizes all those earlier writers like H.G. Wells, Arnold Bennett, and Galsworthy, she praises some other authors for their innovation. And this group of writers she names as spiritualists in contrast to materialists, and here she includes James Joyce. She says James Joyce is an example to follow. She says he has this quality which distinguishes his work from other writers. She says Mr. James Joyce is the most notable from that of their predecessors because his works come closer to life. It preserves more sincerely and exactly what interests and moves them. And along with that, it discard all those conventions which is commonly observed in all those earlier writings. And here she particularly takes the works like the portrait of the artist as a young man and Ulysses. And she says these works record the atoms as they fall upon the mind in the order in which they fall. So let us trace the pattern. However disconnected and incoherent they look, it is a sight or incident which scores upon this consciousness. She talks about the impressionist style of these works. Therefore, Joyce, according to her, is spiritual when compared to materialist. She says that he is more concerned with revealing that flickerings of that innermost flame, that is soul, which flashes its messages through the brain, and he has this courage to completely disregard or discard all those adventitious style. Adventitious style is something like which is unplanned, which is happening as a result of an external factor or chance rather than by design or inherent nature. So he has this courage to discard or disregard what is termed as adventitious and to completely discard all those probability and coherence and bring about all those disconnected, incoherent revealings of the soul. So all these probability, coherence, at one point for all those earlier writers, all these elements like probability, coherences, it acted as a signpost which supported the imagination of a reader, which called upon to imagine what he can neither touch nor see. So all these elements acted as signpost for earlier writers who these writers provided these signposts to the readers so that they can imagine. But these elements are completely avoided by James Joyce. He shows this courage to completely avoid these elements, and he just revealed the flickerings of innermost flame. And here she particularly mentioned the cemetery scene in Ulysses. She says that with its brilliancy, its solidity, its incoherence, its sudden lightning flashes of significance does undoubtedly come so close to the quick of the mind that on a first reading at any rate it is difficult not to acclaim a masterpiece. So with that single scene itself, cemetery scene as you see in Ulysses, it shows the brilliancy and solidity and incoherence and that sudden lightning flashes of significance, and we at the moment itself we acclaim this work as a masterpiece. So the cemetery scene, as you see in Ulysses, is a scene where this major character, Bloom, ponders over this idea of death. And there is this particular character named Martin Cunningham who laments at this grave site. So this is the funeral of Patrick Dignam happening. That is actually the cemetery scene in Ulysses. And here this particular character named Martin Cunningham laments at the grave site of this Patrick Dignam. And what he says is an important phrase in this particular work. He says, in the midst of life, there is death. And you see that in Ulysses, the major thematic concern is that all those dead don't remain buried but continue to haunt everyday life. The cemetery scene, it is also known as Hade's episode, unearths a number of resurrected dead bodies. And here the main character, Bloom, attends the funeral of Paddy Dignan, and his mind is pondering over several deaths, mainly the death of his son Rudy and his father. And we see that in this particular episode, these dead characters are interrupting the flow of life. As I said earlier, what Martin Cunningham says, there is death in the midst of life. But later, at the end of the scene, we understand that the major character, Bloom, completely inverts this idea, and he says, he comes to this point that in the midst of death, we are alive. So this phrase resonates with Joyce as a modernist writer whose new literary language enlivened all those dead characters, dead plots, and even dead languages. For Joyce, we see in the midst of all those dead literature is the possibility to create and express new forms. So this episode, this cemetery scene, is where we see Joyce repeatedly inserting life or the creation of life into this episode of death. So here she proves the point that Joyce is a spiritualist compared to all those materialists who were only concerned with all those external factors, while Joyce is a spiritualist who talked about this innermost flame, that is soul. We see life in the works of Joyce, according to Virginia Woolf. And she says there are some methods to be blamed. She raises these questions like, is it the method that inhibits the creative power? Is it the method that curtails the freedom of the writer? Curtail the creative power of the writer? Is it due to the method that we never feel jovial or magnanimous and we are centered in self in spite of its tremor of susceptibility? We are never ready, these writers are never ready to embrace or create what is outside itself and what is beyond. They neither feel jovial nor magnanimous because they are actually curtailed. Their freedom is curtailed by this method. So these writers are forced to adopt a style which society has imposed upon them. The society has devised a method and a style which these writers should follow. So she says these methods are to be blamed. These methods are the ones which inhibit the creative power of the authors. And now she comes to her point of view about method. She says, any method is right. Every method is right. A method which can express what the writer wants to express. And what we see in Ulysses is that this method has this merit of bringing us closer to what we were prepared to call life itself. So that method is right which brings us closer to life. And here the writer must be free to set down what he chooses. He should have this courage to say that he will no longer follow this method and he will be choosing that method. And out of that alone must he construct his work. That is something like modern method. And modern method can be every method, any method, that which brings us closer to life or spirit. And what modern writers choose, according to Virginia Woolf, for all those modern writers, the point of interest lies very likely in the dark places of psychology. She says at once, therefore the accent falls a little differently, and here the emphasis is upon something which was earlier ignored. At once a different outline of forms become necessary. Here in modern period, we need a different outline of form, which is difficult for us to grasp and which is completely incomprehensible to our predecessors. And here she comes to the writings of Russian writers. She says, Russian writers shows us the way. And here she particularly takes the case of Anton Chekhov's short story titled GUSEV. And she says that in this particular short story titled GUSEV, the emphasis is laid upon such unexpected places. We hear just the conversation between these characters, and at the beginning we feel that there is no emphasis at all. But as we move along, as the eyes accustom themselves to twilight and discern the shapes of things in a room, we completely understand the story and we understand the profundity of the story, how great this vision of Chekhov is. And as you know, Woolf had spent more time in polishing all those translated Russian texts for a British audience, so she has a certain idea about Russian literature. She says that it is impossible to say that this is comic or this is tragic. Never see all those conventional elements you see in British literature. In British literature, as we said earlier, there is this tyranny of plot, of all those cataloging. But here in Russian literature, it is impossible to say that this work is a comic work or this is a tragedy. We are not even certain. Even in the case of short story like GUSEV, we have this idea about short stories like it should be brief and it should be conclusive. But in the case of GUSEV, it is completely vague and inconclusive, and we never know, we can't even call this a short story at all when we take the definition of a short story. So what we see in Russian literature is breaking of all those genres, all those types, breaking away from all those tyranny of cataloging. And what we see, particularly see, is the inner lives of characters. And the point that it can, even a short story can be inconclusive as well. So here Woolf goes on praising these Russian writers because according to her, they have this understanding of soul and heart. They make all those writings which can be felt with the heart. Learn to make yourself akin to people. And their sympathy is not with the mind, not with your head, because it is easy with the mind, but their sympathy is with the heart. We see love towards their fellow beings in their works. And she says in every great Russian writer, she sees this feature of a saint. They have the sympathy for the sufferings of others. We see this love towards others and the element of spirit in their works, which constitute saintliness in their works. So the conclusions of the Russian mind, according to her, is comprehensive and at the same compassionate. And she says more accurately, indeed, we might speak of the inconclusiveness of the Russian mind when compared to all those elements of probability and coherence. What you see in British literature, here we see the elements of incomprehensibility and inconclusiveness. If honestly examined, life presents question after question which must be left to sound on and on after the story is over in hopeless interrogation that fills us with a deep and finally it may be with a resentful despair. So this is how their stories ends. We see the elements of hopeless interrogation, question after questions, which is not answered at all, which may end in some kind of despair. Because According to Virginia Woolf, life is like that. Life goes on. We may not get answers for all those questions in our life. It is something like a hopeless interrogation, and it might end a resentful despair. So this is what she talks about Russian writers and how she has this affinity towards their literature. So here she comes to the end of the work, end of the essay, and she is devising a solution. She says she is asking what shall be the way out. So we have this English fiction starting from Sterne to Meredith in 19th century. So here what we see is in all these works they have this natural delight in human comedy. While in all those Russian works we see this hopeless interrogation and these elements of despair, what we see in English fiction is natural delight in human comedy. And she comes up with a solution. She says that Russian literature offers us that infinite possibilities of the art and reminds us that there is no limit to the horizon. While British literature is limited, it is limited in the sense that they have this method, they will not experiment with other techniques. While she says the true writer should experiment and he shouldn't have a method. She concludes, no method, no experiment, even of the wildest, is forbidden. You can use every method and every experiment. And the things you should avoid are falsity and pretense. She concludes by saying, the proper stuff of fiction does not exist at all. Everything can be proper stuff of fiction. Every feeling, every thought which has life and spirit in it. So the writer is to write what they feel like writing. To conclude, we can say that Virginia Woolf's modern fiction focuses on how writers should write or what she hopes for them to write. She is not suggesting a specific way to write. Instead, she wants writers to simply write what interests them in a way they choose to write, just like you see in the works of James Joyce. Any method is right. Every method is right that expresses what we wish to express. And every method is right which brings us closer to what is called as life or spirit. And the things to be avoided are falsity and pretense, that she connects it to the writings of earlier generation. So here she sets out to inspire writers of modern fiction by calling for originality, criticizing those who focused on all those unimportant things, who spend their energy to bring out all those trivial look true. And here in this essay, she particularly mentioned these three writers, H.G. Wells, Arnold Bennett, and Galsworthy, and she calls them as materialist, and she brings out the spiritual element in James Joyce and how his works are different from these particular writers. And after that, she compares the cultural differences of the writings of Britain and writings of Russia. And here she stops the essay by saying that we need not follow any method. We have this, as writers, we have this freedom to experiment, to use our method to express what we feel. So here I end my lecture on modern fiction. Hope it is clear. Thank you.